I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Queen Elizabeth II's coffin arrived at the St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, Scotland today. The late Queen's 4 children accompanied the hearse on a procession through the city along the Royal Mile. The casket will remain at the cathedral until tomorrow. After the public is given a chance to pay their respects to the Queen's coffin, it will be flown to London on Tuesday. This is where it will lie in state at the Houses of Parliament until next Monday's funeral. Meanwhile, King Charles III made his first visit to Britain's Parliament as monarch earlier today. Like his predecessors, the king reigns but does not rule, and he will largely stay out of the political limelight. Well, joining us now to tell us more about the legacy of our late queen and what to expect from our new king is Dr. Michael Jackson, president and a fellow of the Institute for the Study of the Crown in Canada. Dr. Jackson, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Now, in addition to following the crown for the past 70 years, you were also appointed by the Queen as a commander of the Royal Victorian Order in 2005. So let's start with your own reaction to the passing of the monarch.
Well, my own reaction was one of great shock because the Queen had seemed fine on Tuesday of last week when she met the new British Prime Minister. And then 2 days later, we woke up to hear that she was in dire health, and the family was assembling around her bedside. And then a little bit later came the news that she had died. So it was a great shock, and I'm still recovering from it.
Now, 70 years as the Queen of Canada, what stands out to you as the most significant of her accomplishments and legacy in the royal family?
Well, she has so many accomplishments and so much of a legacy for Canada and the Commonwealth. But I think her sense of duty throughout, she's very hardworking, diligent, devoted to her role as constitutional monarch and head of state for Canada, the United Kingdom, and a number of other realms and territories around the world. And she never said a foot wrong. She always was the right thing to do, the right thing to say at the right time. She was very devoted to her work and remained above the political fray in a very neutral way. And I think her constancy, her neutrality, her enthusiasm for her job made a great deal of difference to the world and to the Commonwealth.
All right, Dr. Jackson. Well, we mentioned that we have a new king now. So how do you see the monarchy shifting or changing under the reign of King Charles?
Well, the monarchy is always changing and evolving. You know, when the Queen started as a young woman of 26, 70 years ago, the world was a different place, Britain was a different place, and Canada was a very different place. And she has adapted and contributed to the adaptation of the crown to the Canadian circumstances. So Canada is now not only a bilingual country, but a multicultural, multiracial country. The Indigenous peoples are playing a much more prominent role in our country, and the Queen and the Crown are very much part of that relationship with the Indigenous peoples. So that's all goes to show that the monarchy adapts and fluctuates and changes according to the way the country changes, and it helps the country change. I think King Charles will carry on that tradition. He has got his own interests, of course. He's going to be very different from the Queen. For instance, he was an environmentalist long before it was fashionable. He warned of the dangers to our environment with global warming and pollution around the world. He drew our attention to that at a very early stage in the game. And he's also been very interested in promoting youth, underprivileged youth in our cities, in promoting multicultural and multi-faith dialogue. So he has all these things to his credit, and I think he will influence our country very much to the positive.
All right, Dr. Jackson, about a minute left here, so let's talk a little bit about logistics. What kind of changes can we expect both in the UK and in Canada, especially in terms of currency?
Well, that means that our coins will need to change. King Charles III's effigy will appear on the coins at some point when they get around to it at the Royal Canadian Mint. We don't know about paper money, whether the image of the new king will appear on the $20 bill or not. That's up to the Royal Canadian Mint to decide and to Canada Post to decide. But I imagine they'll phase these in practical terms. You can't do it overnight.
All right, Dr. Jackson, seems like we've got about 30 seconds left here, but what about the UK? What kind of changes can we see in the UK?
Well, in the UK, one change, of course, has already happened. It's King Charles III, but Prince William is now Prince of Wales. And that's a major change for the heir to the throne to accept that title of Prince of Wales right away.
All right, Dr. Jackson, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, coming up, our interview with Miss Lisa Yu from the David Suzuki Foundation. Stay with us. The United Nations has delivered a word of caution about global warming, saying an irreversible climate catastrophe is looming. A new report from the World Meteorological Organization says weather-related disasters on the planet have increased fivefold over the last 50 years, and they are killing 115 people a day on average. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says it's only going to get worse. Pointing the finger at fossil fuels, he cited the floods in Pakistan, heat waves in Europe, and droughts in several countries. Well, joining us now to discuss this report is Ms. Lisa Yu, Manager of National Policy at the David Suzuki Foundation. Ms. Yu, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Nice to be here again.
So can you give our viewers a brief overview of the major findings in this report?
This new report is a compilation of the most recent science on climate change impacts and responses from multiple UN agencies, compiled from the perspective of the UN Specialized Weather Agency, so a unique perspective. And in terms of its major findings, I'm afraid it's not good news. The report was released under the headline, "We are headed in the wrong direction." The report finds that emission levels continue to rise and fossil fuel emissions are now back to above pre-pandemic levels after a temporary drop during lockdowns in 2020 and 2021, and that governments simply aren't doing enough to cut emissions. The report finds that we're dangerously close, in fact, to approaching climate tipping points as global temperatures continue to rise. 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming is the point at which climate impacts will become increasingly harmful for people and the planet. And this report finds that there's now almost a 50-50 chance that that key threshold will be crossed at least 1 year in the next 5 years in terms of average temperatures. Billions of people around the planet are expected to be exposed to intense climate change impacts.
Very concerning information indeed, Ms. Yu. Now, this report says weather-related disasters have increased fivefold worldwide over the past 50 years. So what has the trend been in Canada in terms of that time period?
Canadian science confirms that it's virtually certain that Canada's climate has also warmed and that it will warm further in the future. And both the observed and projected average temperature increases in Canada appear to be actually above the global average. So the climate is warming in Canada faster than those global averages, as concerning as that is.
Now, Mr. Guterres points to fossil fuels as the primary source of these climate disasters. And he's saying that, that countries that are trying to replace Russian oil, gas, and coal with their own energy are also adding to this issue. So what are some realistic alternatives for such inflation-hit countries amid this ongoing war?
Yeah, it's the question of our time, isn't it? I mean, climate change is already reason enough to decarbonize our energy systems. And the David Suzuki Foundation conducted an analysis with academic partners showing that powering Canada on 100% clean energy is achievable by 2035. But now we're also seeing anew that fossil fuel systems are vulnerable to geopolitical instabilities, like the situation facing Europe right now. Of course, the transition isn't going to happen overnight, but I think current global events really underscore the urgency to decarbonize our energy systems. And moving towards energy independence by transitioning off of fossil fuels and towards renewables not only provides more energy security, but it can also be less costly for people in those countries. And of course, we have to consider the cost of doing nothing. We simply can't afford to not take these actions in light of the findings of this recent report.
Now, what really stood out to me, the term that stood out to me in this report was climate catastrophe. So what would a climate catastrophe look like in Canada?
Well, I mean, in recent years, climate fires and extreme heat events have brought this threat into focus right at our doorstep. And even while we work to reduce emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change, we also need to embrace adaptation strategies that will help make our communities more resilient. Some of the effects of climate change are also more insidious, but still could be catastrophic. Just one example that I think many people will be familiar with of an increased disease threat is the increasing spread of Lyme disease as temperatures warm and ticks establish themselves farther north. So we can expect to see increased climate effects at multiple levels right here in Canada and around the globe.
All right, Ms. Q, thank you again, and we'll be right back after a short break. A Dalhousie University professor whose lab tracks consumers' food spending is voicing his thoughts around a recent move by Skip the Dishes. Dr. Sylvain Charlebois says he suspects the company's decision to lay off hundreds of workers in Winnipeg is because people are bringing food home themselves. He says food delivery apps were incredibly popular when people were stuck at home due to COVID-19. But now he says they can go out and prices are rising with inflation, so people don't want to pay delivery fees. Dr. Charlebois notes a lot of restaurants went out of business during COVID-19, so fewer businesses need delivery services. The company says the cuts come after its parent company conducted a workforce review and decided to make changes for sustainable growth. Well, joining us now to discuss the situation and rising food prices is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois himself. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
My pleasure.
So let's start with this, Doctor. What is the situation behind the layoffs at Skip the Dishes?
Well, first of all, I think you're looking at a company that needed restructuring. So it's quite normal after a couple of acquisitions that a company will recalibrate its workforce. So I think it was expected, but I think at a macro level, you are seeing a different market compared to just a couple of years ago. People aren't necessarily using these apps as often. They will actually go out and get their food themselves. They want to treat themselves. They want to deal with restaurants, but they see those fees. And so, and of course, with food inflation being at more than 10%, people are being very careful with how they spend their money on food. And the other issue, of course, are many chains now have their own apps and are encouraging people to use their own apps instead of going through a portal like Skip the Dishes that would actually offer several options.
So how do you see food delivery apps sort of reacting or adapting to this sort of shift from the pandemic?
I think essentially the food delivery app market is becoming more fragmented. On the one side, you have these portals, major players like Uber Eats and Skip the Dishes offering sort of a food court-esque sort of feel. You have different options, you can pick and choose, and but now you have more and more companies getting organized, knowing that more people are online shopping around, and they actually can offer some discounts, and they can actually control what they can promote much more so than going through specific portals. And I think companies actually appreciate that.
And what do we know so far about restaurants themselves? How have they been faring amid these higher food prices and inflation?
Well, so there are fees. Obviously, you're charged a fee, and typically it's anywhere between 15 to 20% of the cost of the food, which is quite a bit. Now, of course, restaurant operators have access to a new market for them. But with food inflation, they're trying to make sure that their prices remain attractive, but with higher costs, at some point something's got to give. So restaurant operators are trying to find new ways, and there are fewer players on the market. Canada has actually lost probably at least 15 to 20,000 restaurants in the last, I'd say, 12 to 24 months. So quite a few players are now out. And so it's less revenues for companies like Skip the Dishes.
Quite a few losses in the food industry there. Now, bringing this back home to our viewers, as consumers continue to cook or bring home food for themselves, what sort of grocery items are seeing the highest price increases?
Well, these days, dairy is number one right now. You're seeing there was an increase at farm gate of 2.5% just on September 1st. We're feeling it as consumers. They were highs this summer. We're going to continue to see dairy products go up. Bakery is another one category we're watching very closely. Prices have gone up. The center of the store as well. The Canadian dollar is weakening, so whatever we actually import, it's getting more expensive, unfortunately. Although energy costs are down, fuel costs are down, and that's helping.
All right, Dr. Charles Bois, a quick 40 seconds left here, but what trends do you expect with food prices for the rest of this year?
I got two words for you: trading down. Basically, a lot of consumers will be looking for different brands. Even they'll be looking for different locations. A lot of consumers are looking for discount banners, discount stores, and even dollar stores. Sales are up 22% since July for food sales at dollar stores. So you can see that really consumers are becoming way more frugal.
All right, Dr. Charles Bois, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today. Up next, a look at long COVID and who is being affected. Dr. Abhishek Raut joins us. The World Health Organization says at least 17 million people in the EU may have experienced long COVID symptoms during the first 2 years of the pandemic. It finds that women were more likely than men to suffer from the condition. The study for the WHO by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation tracked roughly with other emerging research. Meanwhile, Ontario's recently disbanded Science Table reported that the province needs a comprehensive strategy to deal with long COVID. The team of scientists are calling for substantial investment in research and healthcare resources. They say this is needed to mitigate the long-term health, social, and economic impacts of long COVID. Well, joining us now to talk more on this in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me, Nima.
So how many people in Canada are affected by long COVID, Dr. Raut?
That is a very good question. So we know that early on in the pandemic, the WHO estimated that roughly 10 to 20% of COVID patients would get long COVID symptoms. The Public Health Agency of Canada states it can be somewhere between 30 and 40% of those not hospitalized. And that in itself is a big difference. But now with more consensus coming in, the suspicion is that there is a huge range here, somewhere between 2% and 54%, depending on how you define the condition. Now, the Science Table you mentioned defines it as symptoms ranging for 4 to 12 weeks after a COVID-19 infection. So if we take that as the standard for measurement, we're probably looking at 2 to 10% of all Canadians who had COVID-19 experiencing long COVID symptoms.
Now, what really stood out to me in this report was that women were more likely than men to have long COVID symptoms. Why was that?
Yeah, that's right. So what we saw was that women were more likely to experience this long COVID condition. We saw that women presented with a variety of symptoms, specifically ear, nose, throat symptoms, mood disorders, neurological, skin, gastrointestinal, and even rheumatologic and fatigue symptoms. In contrast, men tend to experience more endocrinology disorders like diabetes and kidney disease. Now, we don't know exactly why that's the case. But what we do know is that women tend to mount a more robust and rapid immune response, which will probably help fight the initial infection. But then when we look at these long COVID measures or long infection measures, you're more likely to have those, unfortunately, there.
So what kind of impact could long COVID have on our already overburdened healthcare system, Dr. Raut?
All right. So long COVID, we know it's a very serious problem with a lot of consequences here. Amongst my own patients and everywhere, we're hearing stories of many people in financial crisis and facing relationship problems, losing their jobs, and falling into depression. Not to mention the healthcare workers themselves who were on the front lines are now experiencing these chronic symptoms as well. So I think what we're seeing is that these long COVID consequences are going to be very severe, and we do need to act on them as soon as possible.
In terms of acting on them, we know Ontario's Science Table is calling for a strategy to deal with long COVID. So what kind of steps should our officials take to address this condition?
Right. So what we know, the big parts of long COVID are fatigue, memory deficits, shortness of breath, sleep problems, and joint pains. So what officials should really do is have a very targeted approach to those 5 things. We need teams of healthcare workers focused on long COVID symptoms. And really the best way to do this is to fund specialized long COVID clinics where you have a group of healthcare workers who can really make a difference and provide relief for these patients who are suffering with these symptoms.
All right, Dr. Raut. Well, over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of ongoing research into the effects of long COVID. So I know you mentioned some symptoms, but did we learn anything new about this condition over the last 2 years?
Right. So I think what we've learned is that a lot of these symptoms are caused by the angiotensin converting enzyme 2, which COVID-19 makes changes to that enzyme to upregulate it. So those changes then cause systemic changes to the body. Damage to the brain causes the brain fog and fatigue. Damage to the heart and lungs cause chest pain, shortness of breath, and palpitations. And damages to the kidney and liver and pancreas causes these dysregulations in our ability to fill out toxins from our bodies. And finally, the damages to the GI tract are these long-term diarrhea, nausea, and throat issues. So there's a lot of individual research into each of these injuries to look at how we can mitigate them and even prevent them in future cases.
A lot of research, but still a lot to be done. Dr. Raut, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Great. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for joining us on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and have a great weekend, Canada.